better than nothing, but it's certainly not enough.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. It's of some frustration that I stand today because New Zealand First would normally support a piece of legislation like this through to Select Committee. But what I have seen, what New Zealand First has seen in this piece of legislation, just like the piece before, that this is so facile, so vacuous, that it serves absolutely no point whatsoever and will achieve none of the stated objectives that this government wants to achieve. We know from experts, we know from our own experience, we know from talking to the people in Auckland that these measures will achieve absolutely nothing. This is another token gesture that achieves nothing. Here's a bright idea. 82% of New Zealanders want a ban on foreign ownership. New Zealand First wants this government to listen to the people for once, and in fact listen to their own support base who want something to be done and something to be done now. So I put it to the members on the other side of the House that what we need right now is a moratorium on the sale of land and houses to foreign investors and foreigners, full stop. Yeah. Stop this free fall into foreign ownership. Only Kiwis should be able to buy Kiwi land and Kiwi homes. Well, the Chinese, the honourable member points out, don't let you go over and buy up Chinese land over there either. And the Prime Minister would be the first to admit that you can't go and buy land in Hawaii if you're not a person of Hawaiian descent. So let's just be consistent with what's happening with the rest of the world. There is a huge problem going on. Let's put a moratorium on this. Let's stop it now. Let's create some real understanding. Let's get some real data so that we can address an issue that we all know New Zealanders understand to be a huge, huge problem. This government needs to stop talking about foreign investment. It is not investment when we sell off strategic assets and homes and lands to foreigners. It is not an investment to New Zealanders. It is of no benefit to New Zealanders. It is in fact the complete opposite. Yet again, we have legislation that achieves nothing, as well as being completely redundant because the legislation is already there. There are already powers to address these issues, and Mr. Bennett himself spoke about it previously. But this national government refuses to have it applied, and so we have this huge housing crisis in Auckland, for example, right now, sir. This government is deliberately tinkering around the edges. Experts are in accord with New Zealand First when we insist this bill will achieve absolutely nothing. Here's a bright line test definition, sir. A bright line is a clearly defined rule or standard composed of objective factors which leaves little or no room for varying interpretation. The purpose of a bright line rule is to produce predictable and consistent results in application. This government says we need a bright line test because the current legislation and intention test is too difficult to enforce because of its subjectivity. New Zealand First says this new bill will only muddy the waters even further and will add another level of complexity to an already difficult and complex set of rules. And we insist this will be of no economic benefit to the country either. We're talking about a tax take of next to nothing. We also insist that Inland Revenue's unwillingness to apply the current legislation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that poor enforcement of the current bill is simply contributes to the perception that the intention test is too difficult to apply. Although it's not hard to understand the confusion, Mr. Bennett's contribution earlier highlighted the confusion that is prevalent throughout New Zealand, and is an example of the problems that will only get worse ahead. So I'll just read one of the intentions of the bill. The bill proposes a new objective bright line land sales test to improve compliance. The bright line test will require income tax to be paid on any gains from the disposal of residential property that is acquired and disposed of within 2 years, subject to some exceptions. So it's not much of a bright line test already within its own description. But a quote from some reports: the bright line test will apply where a taxpayer did not buy property with a purpose or intention of resale, but due to financial or other circumstances, such as loss of employment, relationship breakdown, etc., is required to dispose of the property within the 2-year period. Therefore, there is no economic benefit, there was no intent. It simply happened that they've fallen within the 2-year period, and so they're going to be taxed. And yet there was no intention, and so this legislation doesn't change that, it simply adds to it, and already that level of complexity is ramped up just with that one example, sir. The Minister spoke about removing ambiguity, but as stated, New Zealand First believes this new bill does not achieve what the Minister wants. The application of the main home test will introduce greater uncertainty. This legislation makes no effort to clarify at what point or over what time frame in the dim line time period a property must be the main home. It speaks about a main home being exempt, but nowhere in the legislation does it clarify, well, if you're in it for 2 years, but does it have to be the 2 years? Can you just be there for a certain period of time in the 2 years? Does it become your main home then? The confusion and the complexity continues to mount. I further quote from KPMG report. They note that a full 2-year period of occupation for the main home exemption to apply will not be feasible if the start date for the bright line test is the date of the contract to purchase as recommended, because this property is unlikely to be occupied between the contract date and the date of settlement. So you're getting experts just querying, well, where's your timeline? Where's the definition? Where does it begin and where does it end, sir? Then we have the question around trusts. And a lot of good people, well-intentioned people, have their main home in trusts. They own it, they probably own it with their children. But this piece of legislation will add to the complexity because we don't know how the rule will apply, because trusts are supposed to be able to be taxed under this legislation. But what if it's the main home? We just don't know that at all, sir. And then, sir, we have the question around farmland versus lifestyle block use. So the example, the statement is that farms or lifestyle blocks don't fall under this legislation. So if a person buys a small lifestyle block as an investment and rents it out, and then for unforeseen circumstances, you know, maybe he wanted to retire on it, but for unforeseen circumstances he sells it in 2 years, actually he doesn't have to pay, he's not liable for the tax under this legislation. So where's the consistency? Where's the fairness? The other one that struck me when I was reading the legislation and doing the analysis was the example of people whose careers it is to go and do up homes. They intend to sell their property and make some money out of it, but if they're living in it and if it's their main residence, then under this legislation they're not liable for that tax component. So this, as far as a bright line test goes, sir, just makes no sense whatsoever. Just to conclude, I think this government is deliberately missing the point. There's nothing wrong with New Zealanders owning New Zealand land and just New Zealanders owning New Zealand land. Overseas speculation does not add any real value to the New Zealand economy. This government is keeping its head in the sand. They know this and the previous legislation will achieve nothing. Therefore, New Zealand First cannot support this bill any further. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call James